Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. We've been reading from Imam al-Nawawi's At-Tibyan fi Adabi Hamalat al-Quran, translated as Etiquette with the Quran. And we're in the chapter on specific etiquettes related to reciting the Quran, on page 60, where he talks about reading what has a complete meaning. And so Imam al-Nawawi, over the past few segments, has been talking about various issues related to recitation, like how loud you should recite, how to recite in an assembly, and some issues like that. And today he's going to talk a little bit more about what you should recite and what parts of the Quran. Anyways, we'll just keep going. This is given enough time for people to join that are going to join. Okay, so the author of our book, Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, says, when the reciter begins in the middle of a chapter or does not stop at the end, he should start from the previous words of the surah that are related to one another in meaning. And the same applies when the reciter stops on words that are related to each other or that come at the end of a dialogue. When beginning and stopping, the reciter should not limit himself to strict textual divisions of the Quran, like stopping or starting at tenths, 60ths, and 30ths of the text, since he might be in the middle of an interrelated passage, like at the following 30ths of the Quran, containing words of the Most High that impart meaning only when read and what is connected. And then Imam al-Nawawi gives several examples of what he was just talking about, and I'm going to list those examples, and then I will go back a little bit and flesh out what he said. Okay, so he said at Surah An-Nisa, verse 24, and at Surah An-Naml, verse 56, and Surah Al-Ahzab, 31, Yasin, 28, Fussilat, 47, Surah Al-Zumar, 48, and then Surah Al-Dhariyat, Surah 31. So what he said, in addition to the examples I just gave, is that when we recite, we shouldn't just start and stop based on divisions of the Quran. So we shouldn't start and stop just because it's the 30th of the Quran, or the 60th of the Quran, or a quarter of the Quran. Okay, so just because it's a nice little segment when we divide up the Quran, that alone isn't a good place to stop. Rather, what we should be looking at is that we start and stop at the beginning of something that will have complete meaning. We stop at the beginning of something that will have complete meaning, and then we stop at something that will have complete meaning. So, in practice, we would stop at the end of a sentence, start at the beginning of a sentence. Oh, but wait a sec. Sentences are often related, right? So we don't want to stop in the middle of a quotation or in the middle of a connected story. Okay, so one of the examples he's going to give, or that he gave, has to do with the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. And he mentions that we don't just stop in the middle of a statement where Yusuf is proving that he was innocent of what he was accused of. Okay, so he gets proof, he gets a confession, and then he says, I asked for this inquiry so that Al-Aziz would know that I did not betray him in his absence, and that Allah does not guide the plan of betrayers. Now, if you were to stop there, if you were to stop right there, you would be stopping at the end of a sentence. Great, right? Grammatically, it's an okay place to stop. But the problem is that Yusuf alayhi salam is in the middle of what he's saying. And so if he stopped there and then started again at the next one, then you've broken up something that really needs to go together. Because the next segment, the next piece of it, what happens after that 30th is, and I do not claim innocence for my soul. So he continues here and he says, and I do not claim innocence for my soul. Indeed, the soul is persistent enjoiner of evil, except those upon which my Lord has mercy. Indeed, my Lord is forgiving and merciful. Okay, so you need to read both of those together in order to have the complete meaning. And some of the other examples that he listed there also, they are places where two verses really need to be read together, because part of what is intended in the meaning is presented in one and it's continued in the next. So when we read the Quran, we need to try to choose a set of passages that are related, and we need to really make sure that we don't just break our recitation in the middle or in the midst of reading something. So if you're going to read a story, an event, make sure you read the whole thing. If you're reading some quotations from someone, part of a dialogue, make sure that it's finished before you put it down. And Imam al-Nawawi says it is the same for 60ths of the Quran. And then he mentions Surah Ali Imran, Ayah 203, and Surah al-Baqarah 203, and Surah Ali Imran, Ayah 15. So he gives some examples where we shouldn't do these. Okay, so he says the reciter should not begin or stop at any of these places or their like, since they are related in meaning to what came before it. People should not be deceived by reciters who ignore this etiquette and do not ponder these meanings. The reciter should follow the example of what Al-Hakim Abu Abdullah narrated with his chain of narration, that Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad, may Allah be pleased with him, said, "Do not feel repelled from the paths of guidance by how small is the number of its people, nor be deceived by the large number of those who are ruined. And do not be harmed by how small is the number of those making progress." Rahimahullah. Now this is a great statement about so many things here. Okay, Imam al-Nawawi is citing it here to remind us that we shouldn't be doing something just because it's popular. And we don't leave something when it ceases being popular. We should be doing things because they're right. And correctness isn't often what ends up determining popularity. So if we know that the right thing to do is to make sure that we complete a meaning, then we're not going to stop at the 60th or 30th just because that's where most people do it, or that's where popular people do it. What we're going to do is we're going to stick to the idea, to the rule, the principle, that we recite what has a complete meaning. And so if we get to the end of a 30th or the end of a 60th, and it's in the middle of an account, or the middle of an event, or the middle of a dialogue, or it's in the middle of something that's connected to the previous ayah, we keep reading until we get to the end. Now, for people who don't speak and understand Quranic Arabic, this can be difficult. And so it's one of the things that some of the masahif that are printed today give indicators for. They do give some indicators at times for these things. And it's also something that you'll pick up as you read the translation of the meaning. You'll be able to notice when there are transitions and a lack of transitions. And you can make a note of that in the margin if you need. Okay, so this is something to stick to. So he quoted Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad saying, "Do not be repelled from the paths of guidance by how small is the number of its people, nor be deceived by the large number of those who are ruined, and do not be harmed by how small is the number of those making progress." So in the end, our criteria for what we do and what we leave needs to go back to what's the right thing to do, not to what are the people around us doing. Okay, so if it's popular to always stop on a 30th, and that's what everyone does, well, you're going to have to break from the crowd on this one, because you know that the proper thing to do is that you complete the meaning. Even if it means you're going to have to read an extra ayah or 2 or 3 or 4, you're going to do it. Okay, and then when you come back, you can just take off. You can start from the the section that you had read. So anyways, because of this meaning, and the meaning here he's talking about is reading what's a complete statement or a complete event. The scholars have said that reciting a short chapter in its entirety is better than reciting the same amount of a large chapter in part, since the interrelatedness of its meanings may be hidden to some people in some circumstances. Okay, so we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's the one who portioned up the text of the Quran into surahs, and He put them in a particular order, and there was a wisdom of this. And we know that each surah has something that it's trying to convey, and that a surah is like the complete unit that we work with. So if that's the case, if we want to be sure that we've gotten an entire segment, an entire unit of what Allah is conveying to us, then it would be better for us to stick to a complete surah and not a part of a surah. And this is why, okay, because we want to convey what has complete meaning, this is why it would be better to recite a small surah versus a part of a surah that has the same number of letters. Because we would know that in the case of the small surah that we've gotten the complete meaning. Whereas in the case of a segment with an equal number of letters from a large surah, we can't be sure that we've gotten the complete unit. Okay, so because of this meaning of completion and completeness, the scholars have said that reciting a short surah in its entirety is better than reciting the same amount of a large surah in part, since the interrelatedness of its meanings may be hidden to some people in some circumstances. And Ibn Abi Dawood has narrated with his chain of narration that Abdullah ibn Abi al-Hudayl, the well-known successor, said they disliked it when they read part of a verse and left out a part. So imagine that you have a large verse of the Quran, or a verse that has multiple sentences. It has multiple opportunities where there's a full stop. Even in that case, it would be better for you to have read the entire thing than to just read the first half or the second half of it. And when he says leave out a part, he's not talking about leaving out the middle, reading the first third and the last third, but not the middle third. He's talking about leaving off either like the first segment or the last segment, but still everything else being connected. That's what I get when I read this, because obviously if you had dropped part in the middle, then you would have corrupted the text of the Quran, and that wouldn't be something that people would merely dislike. They would consider it outright haram. Okay, so Imam Nawawi's big message in this section is that we need to recite things that have a complete meaning, and we don't, when it comes to trying to maintain a daily amount of recitation, like a 30th or a 60th, we need to take care that we don't just stop at the 30th or 60th, even that we don't stop there while we are in the middle of something that needs to be connected to what comes after it. So take care of this. When you're going to stop reading your portion of the Quran for the day, take a look and make sure that you can stop there and that you're not in the middle of something. And if you are in the middle of something, just add a few more verses until you get to the end. And you can safely say that I've completed what that meant. Okay. So next, Imam Nawawi is going to talk about some times when it is offensive to read. And he says, know that reciting the Quran in general is absolutely recommended, except for specific circumstances where the sacred law has prohibited its recitation. So as a general rule, all other things being equal, recite Quran, because it's recommended to do. So if there's nothing else, if there's no reason not to recite, you should recite. If there's nothing that has to be said outside of the Quran remains better for you to say. Okay, so know that reciting the Quran in general is absolutely recommended, except, notice he says in general. When we talk about rules and ahkam, we tend to be talking about things in general, and they almost always are going to have some exceptions. So as a general rule, as a rule of thumb, it is emphatically recommended to recite the Quran. But there are going to be circumstances where the sacred law has mentioned that we shouldn't recite the Quran, or we can't recite the Quran, or there's something else we should be saying. Okay, and then he continues saying, I will now mention these circumstances that come to mind, and I will not include their proofs since they are well known. Okay, so circumstances that come to mind. So Imam al-Nawawi, when he lists things off, he's not being exhaustive. He's mentioning the ones that come to mind, so they're probably going to be the most likely and the most frequent cases. And he's not going to give the proofs because the proofs are known from other places, like when you recite fiqh, and some of them are also given in here. Here meaning the book, not this particular section. So he says, it is offensive to recite during ruku'ah and sujood. And one of the reasons that it's offensive there, and he doesn't mention it here, is because something else is supposed to be said. During ruku'ah and sujood, we're supposed to be making tasbihat. We're commanded to make tasbihat, and we're commanded to make a particular dua. And we're commanded to do those, and we're not commanded to recite the Quran. And also during saying the tashahhud, for the same reasoning. And other stations of prayer, other parts of salah, other than standing. Okay, when we stand, that is the time when we recite Quran. The other parts, the other motions of prayer, when you go into sujood, and when you straighten up, when you go into ruku and when you straighten up from it, when you go into sajda, and when you sit in between the two sajdas, and then when you stand back up as you're standing up. Those are not times for recitation. Those are times when you're supposed to be making takbirat and tasbihat and making specific supplications. And those aren't times for reciting Quran. Now, if it's a verse from the Quran that is being recited as a supplication, like Allahumma atina fi dunya hasana, then yeah, it's okay, because there you're not intending recitation, you're intending supplication. Okay, so that's going to be an exception to the exception. So anyways, he says, it is offensive to recite during ruku and sujood, during tashahhud and other stations of the prayer, other than when standing, because there are adhkar that are either required or highly recommended during those other stations. And there's one station of prayer which is devoted to recitation. And it is offensive for someone following the Imam to recite anything in addition to al-Fatiha during an audible prayer. So that includes Fajr and Maghrib and Isha, when he hears the Imam's recitation. So if you're following an Imam in prayer and you can hear his recitation, you don't recite. And the exception to that is you need to recite al-Fatiha. It is one of the essential elements, one of the arkan of prayer, that everyone recites al-Fatiha. This is according to the Shafi madhab, which Imam al-Nawawi is writing according to. Okay, so it's essential for everyone who prays, whether they're leading the prayer, being led in prayer, or praying alone. They must recite al-Fatiha. That's an obligation. It's necessary. It is necessary for them to recite al-Fatiha for their prayer to be valid. Now, if that's the case, even though you shouldn't be reciting when you can hear the Imam recite, if you have to recite while he's reciting in order to recite al-Fatiha, then you do it, because it is obligatory. But if you can hear the Imam recite and you've recited al-Fatiha and you've done what's obligatory for you to do in order for your prayer to be valid, then you need to remain silent and listen to the Imam. So, if the Imam is reciting audibly and you can hear his recitation, then the only thing you're allowed to recite is al-Fatiha, and that's it. If he's reciting and you haven't been able to recite al-Fatiha, then go ahead and recite. If you're following an Imam and for some reason you can't hear his recitation at that time, but you still know his motions, which would be required in order for you to be able to follow him, okay? So you're following an Imam and for whatever reason you can't hear his recitation, then you have an excuse to recite something after al-Fatiha. But the general rule is that when you're standing, the only thing that you would recite while following an Imam is al-Fatiha and nothing else. Okay. It is offensive. So going back, Imam al-Nawawi says it is offensive to recite during ruku and sujood and during the tashahhud and other stations of prayer other than standing. And as for standing, it is offensive for someone following the Imam to recite anything in addition to al-Fatiha during an audible prayer, meaning Fajr and Maghrib and Isha, when he hears the Imam's recitation. It is offensive to recite while relieving oneself or while drowsy or any similar circumstances in which the Quran becomes unintelligible to one. Okay, when relieving oneself, there's evidence indicating that you're not allowed to recite while you are relieving yourself or while you're in a place where or in the toilet. Okay, not supposed to be reciting then. This doesn't mean that you can't listen to the Quran though. So if you are someone who wants to always be listening to Quran, there's nothing offensive or wrong with you having Quran recited, like turn on the radio or the MP3 player and have Quran recited that you can hear while you're in the lavatory. This is permissible. Okay, so while you yourself can't recite, you would still be permitted to listen to someone who is reciting. Okay, or while drowsy or any similar circumstances in which the Quran becomes unintelligible to one. When you're drowsy or when you're really tired, not only are you not able to understand what you're reciting, you might make mistakes, your speech might become slurred, and you might mispronounce, which would be bad. And if someone doesn't know that you're mispronouncing, then they might misunderstand what is supposed to be there and not realize that you're wrong, right? So it's offensive to recite while relieving oneself or while drowsy or in any similar circumstances in which the Quran becomes unintelligible to one. So if you're really tired, instead of knocking yourself out to finish that daily wird or juz that you have, go to sleep, rest for a while. Okay? Because if you're tired, then you won't understand and you might make mistakes, and instead of it being something that's in your favor, it ends up being something that is against you. And you would also be violating the command that when you're tired, you're supposed to invigorate yourself by resting. Okay, so he's talked about some rather general rules about when you should and shouldn't recite the Quran. So the general rule is that it's recommended to recite the Quran. All other things being equal, the Quran is what you should be reciting, and the Quran is what you should be speaking. We have some exceptional cases, like when you're praying, you don't recite Quran when you're in ruku or sujood, and when you're transitioning between stations of the prayer, and if you're following someone in prayer, you don't recite except for al-Fatiha if you can hear them recite. And if you go to the bathroom, you don't recite. And if you get drowsy or you come into a state where you really can't understand what you're doing, then you don't recite. Okay, so next Imam al-Nawawi says, it is offensive to recite during the Friday sermon, during the khutbah, for anyone who hears it, because we're commanded to listen attentively. However, it is not offensive for someone who does not hear the sermon, rather it is recommended. So if you've gone to a huge mosque where you know the khutbah is being delivered, you can just barely hear it, but you can't really tell what's being done. Or you're outside and there's no loudspeakers, but you can tell because of what you see inside that yes, the khutbah is going on, but you can't hear it. Okay, in those cases, you can recite, because you should busy yourself with something when you're in the mosque. So it is offensive to recite during the Friday khutbah for anyone who hears it. So if you can hear the khutbah, even if you don't understand it. So even if you're attending an Arabic language khutbah and you don't know Arabic, or in my case, you're attending a Bahasa Malay khutbah and you don't know Bahasa Malay, you still need to remain silent. Even if you don't understand what's being said, you need to remain silent because we were commanded to listen attentively and to remain silent and not to engage in conversation during the khutbah. Okay. However, it is not offensive for someone who does not hear the khutbah. Rather, it is recommended. This is the sound and the preferred opinion, and the verdict that this is offensive has been related from Tawus, and it has been related that it is not offensive according to Ibrahim an-Nakhai. So there is some variance amongst the very early generations of scholars. But the preferred is that it's offensive. It is possible to reconcile between the two opinions applying what we have said regarding what our Shafi companions have mentioned, namely that this is a matter of detail or nuance rather than something absolute. Okay, so we have the opinion of Tawus radiyallahu ta'ala anhu or rahimahullah that it's offensive. It's categorically offensive, period. Okay, Tawus had the opinion that it's always offensive to do. And then Ibrahim an-Nakhai, rahimahullah, he was of the opinion that it's not offensive at all. So how are we going to try to reconcile what appears to be a disagreement? Well, we would reconcile it in the way that the Shafis have done it, which is it's going to be offensive if you can hear the Imam give the khutbah, but it's not offensive if you can't hear the Imam give the khutbah. So that's how we would reconcile these two opinions. Okay? So Imam al-Nawawi says that there's nuance in here, it's detailed, and that we're going to reconcile them in the manner that he just mentioned. Okay, so that is all I'm going to read in today's segment, and inshallah tomorrow we'll continue with some other rulings related to reciting in particular circumstances. And until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.